Welcome again. I like the stories that I heard. I think we have an interesting fall ahead of us here. I want to especially say I'm grateful for how personal a number of you were willing to be. We don't know each other very well yet. This course has gotten great reviews on the academic rigor, and we want to maintain that. But being personal and academic are not necessarily conflictual, and I would say they can be integrated very effectively. So as modeled by our PhD assistant here, you can be academic and personal at the same time. So this course, eventually what I like about this course is after a while, the reflections about the readings are not just informational, they become at some point vocational. Meaning I begin to hear from you how these readings and conversations are impacting your sense of your own vocation, of what you want to do. I don't teach this course primarily to provide information. I have a particular, I'll just say from the start, an investment in the vocational choices that your generation is making. Those are going to make a big difference to all the things we're talking about. What you decide to do with your lives, energy, time. We'll in fact have a lecture about their difference in vocation and career, which I don't think are the same thing. So I'm glad from the start you're speaking personally, and I hope this course prompts thinking and reflection on what you do after this course and in the years to come. That makes sense? Okay. So I heard your stories. Let me share a little of my own personal story. I was raised in a very evangelical church in Detroit, Michigan. My parents really started that church. It was a Plymouth Brethren church. That meant my mother was really a leader, but she couldn't officially be because she was a woman, but they both really began that church. And I remember when I was about 6 years old, my parents were worried about me because, well, I was 6 and I hadn't really been saved yet. And they were concerned that I hadn't had that experience and professed my faith and was sure to go to heaven and all the rest. So one night we had a revival preacher come in, a Sunday night, and all the unsaved kids had to sit in the front row, which meant me. So he was very fiery, as predicted. And he began to preach, and he pointed his finger. It seemed right at me, and he said, if your mommy and daddy, no, what did he say? He said, if your mommy and daddy died tonight and went to heaven, you would be left all by yourself. That got my attention. You know, I realized at 6, I'd have a 5-year-old sister to support, among other things. And I decided to get this thing straight, get this thing right, and figure out. And so my mother, I took her aside, and she was good at making stuff right. She didn't talk about the wrath of God, but the love of God. God loved me and wanted me to be God's child. I said, that's cool. I signed up. It wasn't deep, but it was, not bad for 6. So that was my first conversion, right? The deeper conversion was when I was about 14. I'm in Detroit. I'm now paying attention to my city. I'm reading the papers. I'm hearing the news, looking around. And I began to ask questions. How come we live the way we do in white Detroit? And life just seems so different from what I can hear in black Detroit, just a few blocks away. I didn't know any hungry people, unemployed people, anybody in jail, and I heard about all that going on that far away. And there were black churches, I was told. We'd never been to them. There were black Plymouth Brethren churches we'd never been to. And who was this young minister in the South named King? What was he up to? They said, you're too young to ask those kind of questions. When you get older, you'll understand. Or they said, We don't know why it's that way either, but it's always been that way. One honest answer was, if you keep asking questions like this, you're going to get into a lot of trouble. And that proved to be true. So I went into the city and I began to look around, pay attention, and I found the black churches, and they really took me in as a young kid, young white kid. And I began to pay attention. And that was the beginning of everything else. But one night I came back to my church and an elder said to me, he said, Jim, you have to understand, Christianity has nothing to do with racism. That's political. And our faith is personal. That's political. And our faith is personal. I was about 15, and I think that's the night that I left in my head and my heart, because here was this issue that was tearing at my insides, this racial polarization in my city, this segregated city where there were two cities, one white and one black. And they said, that issue has nothing to do with your faith. That's what they told me. So I said that I want nothing to do with my faith either, and I left it. And I found my home in the student movements of my generation. We could put, 10,000 people in the streets in about 2 hours' time in those days. And I found my formation there and came back to faith later, that's a different story, from just reading the Gospels. All I did was, on my own, began to read the Gospels, and I found something more radical than I'd ever heard in church. I heard a message that I'd never heard preached in my church, and I came back to my faith at that point. But I didn't have words to go around my experience with the elder back then, but I do now, and the words would be these. God is personal, but never private. Personal, but never private. Faith is always personal, as we've been hearing, but never private. So the rest of my life has been spent trying to figure out the public meaning of this thing we call faith. What does faith mean in the world? What does that mean? So there are always going to be this semester weekly contemporary examples of public faith, how faith is going public, how it's impacting the public conversation. So yesterday, we had a conference call with a number of faith leaders about Syria, what to do about Syria. It's a faith table call that I convene every month. It's a number of heads of denominations and faith-based organizations, and we figure out what we think faith means about something that is in the news. So we had a long conversation, and many on the call believe that the use of chemical weapons by Assad is indeed crossing of a line, and something like that must have moral consequences. But we didn't believe that military strikes would have the kind of consequences that we needed, and I think the president is wanting to see. I trust the president's intention here. We would call each other friends, but I disagree with the tactic of military strikes. We talked about that for a long time, and then on the call, the new Russian proposal began to emerge, and now we're having conversations all day today about how we can maybe find a better way to deal with chemical weapons without military strikes, which could help or could make things worse. Those kind of conversations, war and peace, we'll deal with right here in 2 sessions during our semester. Also a conference call yesterday, a different group of faith leaders on how the deficit, budget, fiscal issues that are coming up this fall have, again, from our point of view, religious implications. For example, next week, it's likely that cuts will be introduced to cut food stamp, SNAP programs by $40 billion or $50 or $60 billion, including literally some of the poorest people in the country, while subsidies for agribusiness and oil companies continue as planned. And so they're picking on the poorest people because they have no political clout. and to attack other things where the money is would be costly politically. So this circle of protection, we call it, and we'll talk more about that when the topic comes up, is the Roman Catholic bishops were on the call, National Association of Evangelicals on the call, Salvation Army is part of this, Bread for the World, Sojourners, lots of organizations who want to make a choice to pick on the poorest people, no longer politically safe for politicians. So that's a whole conversation. We had that yesterday. That's very current. Will be going on while we're in class, while we're having this conversation. They'll be making those decisions in the Congress and Senate. So I'm trying to say we will be talking about stuff that will be going on while we're talking about it outside the room. So there'll be contemporary examples all fall that we can bring to the table and talk about what's indeed going on. I'm a Little League baseball coach, and I coach my son's team, and Sunday, parents were talking about in the sidelines, Washington, D.C., of course, and climate change as a religious issue, as a faith issue, and what we're facing as we approach decisions about the Keystone Pipeline, EPA, all those things going on are really faith issues as well. So how do we talk about that? And then there's Trayvon Martin, 17-year-old young black man who, well, put it this way, if my 15-year-old teenage son had been at the same place at the same time as Trayvon Martin was, he would have come home to me in joy. There's no doubt about that. Trayvon didn't come home because what King preached 50 years ago is still not true. Trayvon was not judged by the content of his character, but by the color of his skin. Yesterday, Otis Moss III, who's now the pastor of the church in Chicago that Jeremiah Wright pastored, at Trinity, he was visiting us yesterday, and Otis's father, Otis Moss Jr., is now 80 years old, from Cleveland. Who's from Cleveland? From Cleveland. Otis Moss is, he took King's parish, his pulpit after King died, and now he's a senior leader in Cleveland. So he's 80, he's in great shape by walking every night after dinner. So he walks at night and he puts like those bicycle lights on his gym outfit, right? So he was walking just a month ago in a gated community in Cleveland, just at dinner like he always does. And he got stopped by the police. They asked for his ID. And Otis gave him the ID. And the police said, "Oh, Dr. Moss, we didn't know it was you. He's a renowned figure on Cleveland. We didn't know it was you. We got a phone call, though. It said a black man was out walking with lights on in the neighborhood." So this conversation really has broken into our discussion about race in America. And here's what I just say about that. We'll talk more about that when we get to it. I'm just previewing some of our topics here. Most white parents in this country have no idea what almost every black parent has been saying to their kids, their sons especially, since Trayvon, about how to behave and not to behave when you're in the presence of the police. And now it's just police, it's anybody who might have a gun, carry concealed weapons, with these stand your ground laws in Florida and 17 states where if you make somebody angry or threaten them, they could shoot you. And as we saw, get away with it. This is changing the whole conversation about race in America, so we'll talk about that. How do we talk about faith in public in the midst of what's happening in our public life? That's what this course is all about. King, remember 50 years ago, gave a speech. He didn't say, "I have a grievance," did he? He said, "I have a dream." Politics is often about grievances, what we're angry about, what's wrong. Movements are generally not born of grievances. They might start that way, but they're not carried forth unless there's a dream. King's dream was not about civil rights or voting rights. It really was what he called a beloved community, which for him was a deeply religious idea drawn from the heart of his black church about what we were supposed to be to each other in this country. And so King's worth a lot of reflection, I think, because King had his Bible in one hand, they say his Constitution in the other hand, and King never said, I get to win because I'm a Christian in what would have been called back then a Judeo-Christian country. Now, when you hear people talking about religion and public life, sometimes they're kind of saying, some of our friends on the religious right, they're kind of saying, we want to win because we're religious and the country was supposed to be or was founded that way, and we really want to use the force of law to impose our religious beliefs on the rest of the country. That's what they're saying, and it makes people afraid. Because now we're a very pluralistic country, and there are more Muslims than Presbyterians. Don't tell the Presbyterians, but that's the case now. And so King never said, he said, I know I've got to win the debate about the common good. King had to persuade the country, not just black Baptists or Jewish rabbis, that civil rights and voting rights were necessary for the good of the country, for the common good, not just for a constituency. So that's the issue here. What is indeed the common good? I was just on this book tour, and I wrote the book on a sabbatical. I took 3 months off from the political news cycle. My discipline was not to speak to it or write about it or be interviewed about it for the first 3 months of the election year. It's a tough discipline, but I did it. And what happened, every morning I would get up early, nice, long, quiet space, exercise, and then I would read, think, study, write all day. At night, though, I'd watch the news cycle. And the more disengaged I became from it, the more depressing the news cycle became, the polarization. Everything was politicized. The anger, the hatred, the vitriol. Gabby Giffords, member of Congress, is a friend of mine. I was with her a week before she was shot in the head out of that angry vitriol. And the more I thought about this, the more I realized we've lost our notion, or we lost any sense of this ancient idea called the common good, which goes back so far in our traditions. And so I found things like this. Listen to this. This is the rule of the most perfect Christianity, its most exact definition, its highest point, namely the seeking of the common good. For nothing can so make a person an imitator of Christ as caring for his neighbors. That was said by John Chrysostom, church father, 347 to 407 AD, a long time ago. They once asked Rabbi Hillel, Jewish rabbi, they said, if you would stand on one foot and tell us the essence of Judaism while you're standing on one foot. So he couldn't talk very long. He said, love your neighbor as yourself. Love your neighbor as yourself. Now, the common good is in all of our faith traditions. It's in Judaism, Christianity. It's in Catholic social teaching for sure, big time, as many of you know. We'll talk more about that. It's in Desmond Tutu talks about it, from Africa, Ubuntu, which means I can't be human apart from you. We got to be human together. But it's also in our secular democratic tradition. So people can join the conversation whether they're religious or not. So in these book tour events, particularly universities or town meetings or bookstores, every time there'll be a young person in the back of the room after the session, the Q&A, who would say, I'm agnostic on my best days, but I hoped I'd be welcome in this conversation today, and I felt welcome. So the common good conversation is one we can have together regardless of our religious affiliation. So it's all over the place. Anybody can be involved, and we're going to explore that for a semester. What indeed is the common good in relation to all the issues that we are talking about? How to restore it, how to find common ground for the common good. Now, what's interesting is this fall, I'm going to predict you're going to see nothing of any bipartisan substance, collaboration come from Washington, D.C., except one thing. There's a good chance that we're going to get comprehensive immigration reform. Now, we have 2 sessions on that in this class. Those against immigration reform had $10 million to spend to stop it. And so what they were going to do is use the August recess to kill it the way they've killed other things. If you recall the shouting matches in town meetings when the members of Congress go home to their districts, we've seen that before. This time, they lost the August recess because pastors showed up, church people showed up, young people showed up. And in particular, something we put together called the Evangelical Immigration Table was launched. And this says evangelical Christians who are very conservative, but who've come out, and like Bill Hybels, for comprehensive immigration reform. People who used to just thump their Bibles are now reading them. And they found the 25th chapter of Matthew where it says, Jesus is saying, I was hungry, I was thirsty, I was a stranger, and the word there, stranger, means immigrant, foreigner, stranger. I was sick, I was in prison, and you didn't come to me. And all the people said, when do we see you hungry and thirsty and naked, stranger, sick and in prison? And he says, as you've done to the least of these, you've done to me. So all these evangelicals realize over these past couple of years, the way they treat 11 million undocumented people, that's what we have now, 11 million undocumented people, the way they treat them is the way they treat Christ himself as an evangelical. And that's been converting for a lot of evangelicals. Secondly, the immigrants have joined their churches. Almost all the churches now, Catholic, Southern Baptist, Evangelical, the only growth in their churches now is immigrants across the country. So all of a sudden folks are worshiping in the pew next to you, so you get to know them and their kids and your kids and playing with their kids, and before long they're part of the community and their kids feel like your kids. And the leaders realize this is the future of their churches. So that has changed the whole constituency. So I got a call in July from Paul Ryan, Republican leader. Now, Paul Ryan and I disagree on the budget. We know that, many things. I don't get many calls from Paul Ryan, but I did one day said, Jim, can I help you with immigration? And so we had evangelicals come meet with Paul Ryan, and he's helping us on immigration because, as he said, we have an immigration vote coming up, and for the first time, you have a grassroots constituency that can influence the right and Republicans on an issue like this, as well as Democrats. So on an issue like immigration, you see how religion is playing a role, a very distinctive role, in making a key reform possible. So we'll go through all that in the course of those 2 weeks. And while we're doing it, it probably will be being debated in the Congress. And so I'll bring somebody here who's in the middle of that conversation to talk to you about how faith people have been mobilized to change the course of what could be the first time in many, many years reforming a broken system. Now, I gave a quiz in England, and I want to do it here too. What is the largest growing religious affiliation in America? Largest growing affiliation in America. When people check a box, I am this, that, the other, what's the largest growing one? What do you think? Quiz.
Mormonism?
Good answer, but no. Yep.
None. Yeah.
None of the above is the answer. That's the box. None of the above. So in England, they said Muslim, Mormonism, they said Jedi. You know, I was hoping that'd be true, but it wasn't true. None of the above. That's the fastest growing religious affiliation in the country. A lot of young people would put, some of you put yourself in that category from what I was hearing. What's interesting is most of those people believe in God still, they would say, by the polls. But they don't want to affiliate with religion because of what religion is or isn't or says or doesn't say. They don't want to affiliate, but they still would say they believe in God. Now, I love the nuns, I love the other nuns too, N-U-N-S. In fact, I'll say that when I would be out speaking across the country as a young man in very conservative evangelical places like Wheaton and other places, I'd always have 2 rows of Catholic sisters every time in their full habit in the auditorium or the chapel. And I'd walk up with, sisters, what are you doing here? And they'd say, well, we're local. I said, yeah, I figured you're probably local, but why are you here in this conservative place? They said, Jim, we heard you were coming. This is a very conservative place, and we thought somebody here should have your back. So I had nuns as bodyguards for years in all these conservative places. So I love the nuns. But I love these other nuns too, these N-O-N-E-S. And what I interpret from them in a lot of conversations is there are many people in your generation, not all of them, but a number of people in your generation who really want their lives to matter in the world. They want, and if they're people of faith, they want their faith to matter in the world. They want to change the world. Some just want to fit into it, fit into a nice niche and find a good, lucrative place to sit. But more and more of your generation want to change things. So they're drawn to wherever that's happening or whoever's doing that. Did you all, any of you watch this Bible series in the spring that was on Discovery History Channel or something? My kids did because it was very dramatic and Bible stories, and kids love that stuff. But it was a very successful, coming to Britain in the fall. It was a big, called The Bible, over Lent, I think, finishing on Easter. And the people who did that, they're Hollywood Christian types. And they're very nice people, Roma and Mark. And they sent me the tapes, and I watched them, and they wanted some comments, and I get them. But the one I liked best was this wonderful scene of Jesus, he's on the Sea of Galilee. And here's Peter, fisherman, in the boat, and Jesus wants to meet him, So he walks, not on the water, but into the water, and he crawls in the boat with Peter. And Peter says, what do you want? He says, I think you should cast your net over the side. Peter says, there's no fish today. And the Jesus character says, no, go ahead, trust me, throw your net over the side. You know the story. He throws the net over the side, and all kinds of fish come in the net. So 2, 3 times. So Peter says, how'd you do that? And the Jesus character doesn't answer his question. Instead, he says to Peter, follow me, and I'll make you a fisher of men and women. And Peter asks this great question. He says, what are we going to do? I love that. What are we going to do? And Peter says, and then Jesus says, change the world. Change the world. Now, what if Peter said, what are we going to do? And Jesus says, well, we're going to save a few people from hell and judge all the rest. That would have really flown. That would have been a big movement, I'm sure. So when Roma and Mark came to their premiere of the movie in D.C., they invited some of us to come, and they sat down and they said, did we get that right, that change the world thing? That's not in the text, but it seemed like that's what we was talking about. And I guess that's what a lot of people are hungry for. Is this supposed to change the world, or just change your life? Your personal, private life, you and the Lord, you and a higher being, you and whatever you want to say the other is. Is this supposed to just change you or change the world? Which is it? For Christians, I always say the kind of Jesus you believe in will shape the kind of Christian that you are, And that's true for the rest of it too. So what does it mean to believe that your faith is supposed to change the world? I think that attracts people when people of faith actually say and do what their faith suggests they should say and do. When they actually do that, 2 things happen. One, people are surprised, usually, when people of faith do what they're supposed to do. And they're attracted. They're surprised, and then they're attracted. So all over the UK, in a very secular country, I still found a whole lot of young people coming out to every event. We were in They were in Belfast, Manchester, Edinburgh, and London. And still, even though it was the secular country, a lot of young people came out these weeks because they wanted to talk about what it meant to change the world and how this thing called faith could make that more possible. So that's our conversation for 13 weeks. How does that relate to public life? And we start a discussion with 2 speeches on faith and public life by 2 presidents, Barack Obama and John Kennedy. And you read those and made your comments, and we'll start to discuss those in a few minutes here. What does the separation of church and state mean? And what doesn't it mean? Does it mean the segregation of moral values from public life? How are those values expressed religiously? Symbols, scriptures, language from many faith traditions. How do we deal with religious fundamentalism, which is found in all of our faith traditions? But in EJ's article, he's suggesting there's also, I would call it, a kind of secular fundamentalism, those who are hostile to religion per se, when it wants to live in the public square. So we see that on the right, on the left, is an expression of religious language in public life consistent with a pluralistic democracy, where we're very diverse now, and we're now no longer Judeo-Christian, Judeo-Christian Muslim, and Buddhist, and Hindu, and many would say they're spiritual but not religious, as Jacob was saying he was religious and not spiritual. There's a whole denomination on the West Coast. They're spiritual but not religious. Ben and Jerry, Ben Jerry ice cream. Ben Cohen tells me he's spiritual but not religious. I said, Ben, offer more ice cream. You could be the bishop of this thing. So he's thinking of doing that. So this first week together, I'd like to hear your questions about that subject of faith, that faith and social justice, like many were talking about. What are the questions on your mind as we start? We won't get to them all today, but we'll get to them over the course of the weeks. What questions do you bring to this course is the issue. In Belfast, I'll just tell you this story. In Belfast, I went to an ecumenical center. I was there during the Troubles and difficult times, and I was with the people who were trying to make it work. I remember I was there once. We had about 1,000 people there, and in the front row were these women. And I was doing a week on the Beatitudes, Sermon on the Mount. And these women, the first night, I could just see tears running down their faces. And I asked, who are those women? And they were the mothers who had lost their children in the Troubles, the violence. And they were both Catholic and Protestant. There they were, arm in arm on the first row, saying, we've got to stand together and stop this. And they were subject to all kinds of threats because of their stand. People like that made the peace process possible. So now I'm back, and a new generation is now there, and they're having a lot of violence over flags. The Union Jack flag and the Republic of Ireland flag. You raise a flag at the wrong time, wrong group, and they start fighting and killing each other, just in the last year. So here's this place right in the middle of all the violence, the poorest places, and the center is been set up, and they're providing services and they're taking care of people, but they're also providing a safe place. They have a public square that's a safe and secure shared public square. And on their square, there are no national flags or brands. Their flags are celebratory and festival flags and colorful flags that we use to come together for festivals. And in the name of their place, it's a Greek word, I said, where'd you get that name? He said, well, in John, Gospel John, chapter 1, verse 14, it says, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. That's the traditional translation. The Greek there for dwelt among us is the Word became flesh and pitched its tent among us. pitched its tent among us. Or Eugene Peterson in his translation, The Message, says, the Word became flesh and moved into the neighborhood. It's a very powerful notion of the Catholic idea of parish. St. Catherine's used to think, they're responsible for these 19 square blocks, whether the people there were believers or not, and 24/7 responsible. So a church I know in Boston, good friend is pastor there, and one Saturday night, this kid got shot and killed on the steps of the church, but nobody was there. Just shot and killed. The church has to pray through whether or not they think they're responsible for what happens on their steps when nobody's there. Are they responsible for that? And they decided they were, and they began a project that we did with them, 10-Point Coalition, to put pastors out into the streets to walk with the kids at night when nobody was there. And that 10-Point Coalition, after 2 years, had reduced youth homicide by 70% in Boston. And the police chief gave credit to the pastors for doing this. So the notion of parish, the common good, taking your faith to the streets, this can make a difference in public life. And I think when we show that, it really opens up a conversation. A whole lot of people, whether they're religious or not. So I'm thrilled to have a chance to do that, not like in Belfast one night, Edinburgh one night, Manchester one night, but for 13 weeks, I think, here together, same group of people around the same table to talk about this for all that time. So we're going to get deeply into all this stuff over the course of this class. So let me stop here, and from what I've said just so far, and let's hold the readings for a moment, but just your response to this whole notion of faith in public life. What are the concerns, questions, issues that are on your mind as you think about that, and we start to talk about that? Now, there's Oprah Winfrey back here with a microphone, so we're going to just have Jacob pass it around. And again, just forget the cameras, let's just talk together. What are some of the questions or comments you have just to what you've heard just in this few minutes so far? And let's not be shy, let's jump right in. Who'd like to start? And as we're learning each other's names, if you'd tell us again from the start what your name is, and then we'll get to know each other.
Okay. My name's Michelle Moore.
Right.
And I think one question that keeps being raised is the idea of compromise, and not only politically, but also within the sphere of religious, between various religions.
Mm-hmm.
So one question that I would have is, to what degree do people of different religious institutional faiths need to compromise their own beliefs in order to live in a pluralistic society? And can you have a truly pluralist, or can you have a comprehensive social justice movement without any compromise of those beliefs?
Mm-hmm. Good question. Let me take a shot at that. One time we were having a vigil at the Canon office building at the House because they were passing a budget that was cutting enormous low-income people stuff, just cutting it right out of the budget. And we tried every other method, talking to people and op-eds and press conferences, they weren't listening. So we had a prayer vigil over at the Canon office building. And it was mostly Catholic sisters who wanted to do some black clergy and evangelicals. So a rabbi came to me and said, could I join you as a rabbi? Do you have room for a rabbi? I said, sure, we're going to do the Isaiah text and you can read it. So he came. And he read Isaiah 6, which says, woe to you legislators who pass these laws and trample on my people. It's a great text for being over there at the House of Representatives. And anyway, we were praying on the steps and they decided to arrest us all. So they arrested us and put us in the DC jail, a couple hundred faith leaders. So we're in the DC jail, and on the bench in the DC jail, the rabbi and Tony Campolo, who's an evangelical evangelist for justice, are talking, and they know each other, but they're having a real rigorous conversation theologically about who was Jesus Christ. Was he just a prophet or the Son of God? And it wasn't kind of, I'm okay, you're okay. It was like, no, who, it was a really serious, theologically, it was a conversation about Christology in the DC jail, So I was watching them and I thought to myself, this is how we do it. We all get arrested for our faith and discuss theology in jail. So my friends, Muslim Jewish friends, they say, be the best Christian you can be. I'll be the best Muslim Jew I can be. They don't tell me to compromise or water down my beliefs, nor do I want them to do that. But then we find where is the common ground. And when we can speak together on Syria or immigration or whatever, always being who we are, it can be a very powerful thing. Now, compromise politically is also a good question, which you're raising, like immigration. The bill that passes will not be the bill that I would have written if I could just write it. It'll be a compromise. But we've gotten both the Republicans and the Democrats to agree to certain foundational principles, one of them being that eventually those here for a long time will receive an earned path to citizenship. And we wouldn't have compromised that, to have a second-class group of guest workers. And we've gotten so far, both sides to agree to most of what we're pushing for. So you have to, though, have those questions. What will you compromise and what will you not? And so, but the public square is, as you say, diverse and pluralistic. So you can't just impose your will. But how do you leverage this? How do you move things in ways they wouldn't move by themselves? One principle that I'm going to be saying over and over again is the common good comes last to places like Washington, D.C. and London. Politics can't change itself. It never has been able to. It's social movements outside of politics that change politics. Abolition of slavery, women's suffrage, civil rights, that's what changes politics. So most of those reform movements historically have always had the faith community at their animating core. It's never just the faith, never just us. It's always lots of folks. But those movements almost always have faith people at their core. So how do we create social movements that make political change possible? And I'll talk specifically about how the White House on immigration. Now, the White House, Republicans and Democrats have really been moved by the outside movements of faith-based organizations. But compromise is part of that, but you can shape it, leverage it, and move it one way or the other, but only by movements from the outside, in my experience. Make sense? Other questions? Let's pass it around here. I'll get the hands up.
I'm Kendall Ciesmeyer, and I guess my question is, you talked about the growing category of nuns,
Yeah.
Especially among the millennial generation.
Yeah.
So, if the millennial generation is so opposed to organized religion and so off-put by organized religion, how can all religious institutions come together and work together in a way that will, how can we convince nuns that organized religion is an okay thing, and that how can we kind of right the wrong of judgment that has been so prevalent in organized religion's past?
That's a big question. My experience, I feel very lucky because I'm in my 60s now. I've got young kids, but in my 60s, and half our audiences are under 30, everywhere we go. My staff, I've got senior staff that are 27, 28. I left them to come here. So I'm with younger people all the time. And I think the nuns phenomenon is really encouraging. But I must say, a lot of religious institutions and leaders are threatened by it because they're not coming to church. Their whole thing is, how can we get them back into our churches? So you got, exciting preachers and good music, and come to our Friday night, young people's night. You can skip the bar and meet, date good-looking people. It's all the stuff they want to say to get you to come. What I'm saying is, you won't get people to come to church mostly by what happens inside the door of that church, but by what happens outside the door of that church. In fact, there's this really interesting report I heard in the UK from somebody studying the new Pope, Pope Francis. And apparently all the candidates who were, likely or possible for Pope got to give 3.5-minute speeches. And so this Pope Francis gave a talk about that text where it says, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock." It's an old text that I was taught meant that's Jesus standing at the door of your heart, knocking. You got to let him in. That's what I always was told. What he interpreted the text to mean is, no, this could be Jesus standing inside the church, at the door of the church, trying to get the door open, to get the Christians outside of the church to be the church of the poor in the world. So he turned the whole thing around. And what I've been told is that was very persuasive to a number of other cardinals, that whole notion of turning the whole thing around and becoming a church of the poor. So what I find is when the nuns see people of faith actually moving into situations of religious conflict, Christian-Muslim conflict, which we'll talk about, immigration, racial justice, women and girls, all of that, when they see us doing those things, then they're very open to the conversation. But we're not going to get them to come back to our churches by what happens on the inside of our churches, but by what happens outside the doors of our churches by those who are on the inside. Does that make sense? Yeah, that's what I'm hearing around the country. There's a hand over here, just right across the table.
I was struck by one of the things you said about the Christian right, and they claim that they have hold on kind of the foundational thoughts of America, and this idea that the United States is inherently a Judeo-Christian country.
Mm-hmm.
Now, some might dispute that, but do you think that there is maybe not a prevailing religion that animates the United States, but a faith of any kind? So we talk about we've characterized the United States as pluralistic earlier.
Right.
But is there more than that? I mean, is there something inherent to the American experience that's different in conversations like this than Britain, for example?
Robert Putnam, who is at Harvard, teaches sociology, has done a lot of work on this, and I think some of you, in fact, one of you in your papers mentioned civil religion, Robert Bella, and that's been talked about for many, many years. America has kind of a civil religious faith. I think that it's diminishing as we're more pluralistic, and a younger generation doesn't share all those assumptions. So, yet I think there's still things that can be appealed to that seem to really galvanize people. So I was serious when I said before whether King would have been as effective in the UK without the sort of culture that was affirming of religion, or whether King would be as effective now or 20 years from now as he was 50 years ago. Those are fair questions. I think on immigration, though, for example, we came to Washington, D.C. 6 months ago, this campaign called Bibles, Badges, and Business. We had faith leaders, business leaders, and law enforcement leaders together saying, fix this broken system. They're all effective. They all had their things to say, but the business and badges people told us that they thought the Bibles people, the faith people, had more impact on the conversation. And in this case, we become kind of the leveraging point in the debate because we can appeal to people on both sides of the spectrum. So I don't think we're the Judeo-Christian civil religion we used to be, but I think, though, this moral compass conversation still has great appeal, particularly among younger people. So I think I end up talking more about values than doctrine. You know, what are the values that we want to operate by? And many of them come right from our traditions, but they're not limited to people of faith. See, I always want to say that religion has no monopoly on morality. And those of us from the faith community have to say that a lot, that we believe, I'm a person of faith, I'm unapologetic, but I don't believe religion has a monopoly on morality. And I've literally put my life in the hands of colleagues in situations of violence, for example, around the world, who were not people of faith. And I put my life in their hands because I trusted them as my colleagues. So that opens up the conversation, I think, in a way that people who are protected institutions are more defensive about that. So I think that's a conversation that's still very much open. But you can't assume, and you can't assume everyone knows that hymn. You can't assume everyone knows that Bible story, because people often don't anymore, you know. Over here. Then we'll take a quick break and come back to the readings.
So my name is Colleen once again, and you spoke earlier in the lecture about how Bible thumpers were kind of waking up to the idea of the role of Christianity in immigration reform and how they've been influencing more conservatives and kind of mobilizing on these social issues. And something that's always been really interesting to me is the idea of partisanship in faith, because in my experiences, I feel a lot of times that people kind of assume that the Republican Party is the party of religions. You have terms like the Christian right. As a Catholic, people often assume I'm Republican. But if you look, for me, I personally believe there is no party has a hold on religion or Christianity, especially in terms of Catholic social teaching. Neither party really understands the breadth or full spectrum of Catholic social teaching. So as Christians are starting to mobilize more towards social issues, what do you think the role of partisanship will be? Do you think that parties will kind of adapt to kind of Christian mobilizing? So do you think that the Republican Party, for instance, might move more left in terms of social justice issues? Or do you think it will kind of be more up to the Christian groups who are mobilizing to kind of be bipartisan or nonpartisan and kind of pick and choose?
It's a great question. Let me flip back to you, though, for a minute. Say what you mean when you, I think you're right, but say what you mean to the rest of the class about how Catholic social teaching doesn't fit the categories of Democrat, Republican, left, and right.
Yeah, so I think I'll give more tangible examples. In terms of Catholic social teaching, a big one is the idea of being pro-life and anti-abortion, and also kind of traditional marriage. So those ideas are traditionally seen as more Republican values, whereas social justice issues such as immigration reform, such as welfare programs, including SNAP, are considered more on the left or Democratic issues. So it's something I've kind of struggled with as a Catholic Democrat because I kind of prioritize social welfare issues, but a lot of times other Catholics will prioritize pro-life issues. So I think it's kind of the idea that Catholic social teaching encompasses a lot of things from climate change to just war theory, but kind of neither party really fits those, the whole breadth of Catholic social teaching. So in terms of kind of, again, reconciling your faith with politics, because there's not really an option for someone who really believes all the doctrines, which I personally don't. I don't know if there's how many Catholics out there really do.
Well, take those categories, left and right are political categories, not religious ones. So when we try to squeeze our faith into political categories, I think our faith gets distorted. So politics wants to use religion, and we have to always be careful about not being used by either side. But I think it really calls both to account. The parties are more and more alike in Washington. John Kerry once told me that when he was a senator, that he had to raise, on average, $20,000 per day to be reelected. That's 4 hours of fundraising every day if you're a senator. And that means who do you talk to? Who do you have lunch with? So wealthy elites really control both parties. And to get Democrats to talk about poverty is very difficult. To get them both to work in immigration has not been easy. And people are lining up on the serious stuff mostly along party lines. People that I know would be against the military strikes, I know they would be if a George Bush was calling for them, are supporting them because of Barack Obama's calling for them. And people I know would be on the other side if a different president was calling for it. So it's really quite often disturbing how partisan things become when I think people of faith are going to ask questions that cut across, like the Republicans will appeal to evangelicals and Catholics who are pro-life, but they won't deal with the death penalty as a pro-life issue when the Catholic bishops do. So, or a consistency of being for children before they're born, but not really on their side afterwards in terms of snap cuts and so on. So where's the consistency on both sides? And holding both sides accountable, I think, is a good function for the faith community, but that really does cut against the partisan lines.